So up next, number 3, we have Francisco Lindor. And Lindor had one of the most interesting seasons by a Met player in their first season in New York by a major acquisition. So when the Mets acquired Lindor before the 2021 season, it was an interesting part of Lindor's career. He had had obviously great success up to that point in Cleveland for several years with them. He had become one of the faces of Major League Baseball. So when the Mets acquired him, there was obviously great excitement. His 2021 season, however, is something of a train wreck. He didn't hit at all, but then again, so did pretty much everybody else on the team. Was failed to play at the standard that we expected him to play. But it was especially bad for Lindor, who was expected to be the franchise player that the Mets really needed and had acquired for a considerable haul. We got a player across the board who had failed to play up to stuff. We were expecting an all-star, let's say right there, and that first season he has just an absolute train wreck of a year. And during his time in Cleveland, as I mentioned, 6 years. He makes 4 All-Star teams. He's an MVP candidate. He's considered one of Major League Baseball's most visible stars. And indeed, we almost thought this was going to be one of the worst transactions in Mets history because the players they traded at that point were Ahmed Rosario and Andres Gimenez. And Gimenez especially has played very well with the Cleveland Guardians in 2022, had that breakout year. So his 2021 season is just such a mess. He finishes the year with just 20 home runs, 63 RBIs. He bats a minuscule 230. That is the lowest of his career, and this is quite honestly the worst year of his career. And honestly, what I just said at that point, his total stats for the entire year, which again I also want to mention also. He was hurt for a portion of the year, only played 125 games. He returns after the injury and actually plays pretty well up to that point. His second half, far better than his first half, and it's basically what saves the season. That first half of the season was just an absolute mess. And again, nobody on that 2021 team could hit. It was just across the board. A lot of people struggling. Jeff McNeil was struggling. Pete Alonso was struggling. Really everybody did, and it was just a real mess of a season. And Lindor was unfortunately the prime suspect in a lot of this because he was the guy being paid a lot of money, and unfortunately that does play out most of the time. Like, you're going to get the majority of the blame, and Lindor didn't really handle it very well. Lindor's reputation has always been that he is a tremendous fan favorite and a great leader, and in this season he kind of abdicates everything. He really screws up in a couple of moves. There is of course the infamous fight that he had with Jeff McNeil that neither one of them wanted to come out and say. It was this real problem where it did point to the leadership problems that Lindor was sort of failing on his end, but also you could point to Mets management. A lot of people really is failing to step up, and the result of it all was just this, a PR nightmare for him. And then it leads into probably the worst moment of Lindor's career when he decides, in a moment of real questionable judgment, to flip off New York Mets fans, flipping the bird, and as a way of, I guess, saying, you know what, the hell of you for not supporting me even through my darkest times. And honestly, it's the dumbest thing in the world. I always hate it when athletes take it personal like that. It's just really stupid. I wish that they would understand that, Mets fans, and really any fans, they don't want to boo you, but you're really giving them no choice at that point. And they can't just expect them to give you, universal support through thick and thin, especially when you've only been there for part of one season at that point. And it was just unrealistic, and he just, at this point, just kind of redirects his anger about himself towards the Met fans. And the result of it is another enormous PR mistake. It's something that, after it happened, a lot of people were wondering if he couldn't really return from that. It was just an absolute mess. Again, I mentioned he hits much better in the second half of the 2021 season. And that kind of saves his season, and also points to people who were like, okay, he kind of got it together near the end of the year. So there was some hope that he was going to kind of take that with him into 2022. He does it great. He really sees a great year from him. It looks much more up to standard with it from his time in Cleveland, where he's flashing more of power, looking a lot more competent. He sees his batting average jump from 230 to 270 in 2022. He sees his RBI count jump up dramatically. He ends up driving in 107 batters, which is a career high for him. And I remember through all of last season, just watching him, I was like, they need him in that lineup. He is so important, and it's not just in his performance at the plate, which of course is very important for Lindor, but his tremendous defense and leadership from the dugout. He was doing a much better job, and part of it was, nothing cures all ills like winning. People can feel great about each other when your team's just flying ahead and in first place for much of the year. And you saw his interactions with Jeff McNeil improve, Pete Alonso improve. Everybody really, feeling very, very good with Lindor, and that was very important. I'll also point to his excellent defense, and Lindor is a remarkable defender. I think he's one of the best infielders the Mets have ever had, and he is a real general out there. He really makes that entire infield defense look a lot better, and there are times that it's not particularly fantastic. If Lindor's not in there, so he does make his presence felt. He is, by all accounts, a terrific teammate. The questionable decisions of 2021 notwithstanding, he made it much clearer to everybody that it was more of an aberration than anything. Very important for him to make that clear to everybody that his performance, not just on the field but in the press, and doing everything off the field that he had been doing, was just poor decision making, and he really did bounce back from it. Ultimately, he returned him and has now become the all-around player the Mets were hoping that he would be when they traded for him. And while he's not rediscovered the 30 home run power that he had displayed in Cleveland, he is still undeniably a game changer who the Mets Mets really do need on a day-to-day basis. So I've been thrilled with his turnaround, and I've commented on more than one occasion. He is the most important player in that lineup, and in the infield, in the dugout, maybe as important as anybody can be on a contender right now. It is so important for Lindor to continue to play at this level and above. I would like to see him even improve even more in 2023. But if his basement is 2022, I would be thrilled with that as well. He has shown that he is quite possibly the best two-way player on the Mets, and one of the best two-way players in all of baseball. So an absolutely terrific acquisition by the Mets when they brought in Lindor, and this was something that really needed to be done. It was a game-changing move. It was a real gamble. It was something that could have turned out really badly after that first season, but he has bounced back in terrific fashion, and I'm so eager to see what he's going to do in 2023. So, number 2 on this list, we're up to the final 2 picks of the best Mets offseason acquisitions since 2000, and my pick is going to be R.A. Dickey. Now, for those who might be wondering why R.A. Dickey goes ahead of Francisco Lindor, let me tell you. When the Mets acquired Dickey in 2009, December 2009 was when they had acquired him, they were signing him as nothing, really. He was a barely advertised, free agent acquisition, really just a blip of anything. And his acquisition really meant nothing for the Mets. It was not a gamble. They were going to be paying him They don't really have a salary listed for him for 2010, what he was making with the Mets, but I'm going to assume it was under $1 million. He was not a high-profile acquisition, to say the least, and his entire major league career up to that point had been absurdly bad. He was a fringe major league player at best, and Dickey's career, unfortunately, he had a lot of up and down moments. He was taken in the first round by the Texas Rangers of 1996 draft, but there were some questions about his elbow. Ultimately, they signed him, but his career in Texas does not go the way that it was expected to go. He has a slew of problems pitching at the major league level, and his ERA before the Mets acquired him, his time in Texas, 1 year in Seattle, he has a pretty bad stretch, a career 5.57 ERA, had only won 21 games at that point, lost 27. They had tried him as a starter, they tried him as a reliever, nothing was really working for him, and so when the Mets acquired him, it is such a nothing acquisition. I'm sorry, also 1 year in Minnesota that I forgot to mention also. So the ERA is actually 5.43. So his performance is nothing really spectacular. And when they bring him in, there wasn't even an expectation that he was going to make the team. Ultimately, because the Mets are snake bit, there is an opening in the Mets starting rotation through various problems to various starters, but he ends up joining the team fairly early that year in 2010 and shocks everyone with this incredible season in 2010. He goes 11-9, posts a 2.84 ERA. As a knuckleballer, he does not strike out a lot of guys that year, but displays terrific control, which is not something you would say ever about a knuckleball pitcher. Knuckleballers are traditionally bad control guys because they're throwing a ball that really can't be directed, and because of this, they're notoriously wild knuckleballers like Tim Wakefield, Phil Niekro. These are just a couple names to mention. They were guys who were just as likely to hit somebody with the knuckleball or throw it or throw a wild pitch as they were to get a strikeout. Dickey is what is known as something unusual. He is known as a more controlled knuckleballer, which is to say that he's able to throw what can be construed as a power knuckleball. He throws it a little bit harder than what is generally seen, which is in the past had been seen as a 65, 70-mile pitch, really. He throws it in different speeds. Sometimes he'll flutter it in the low 70s, but other times he would bring it in at like the low 80s, and it was very unusual, and it made him very hard to kind of figure. Not to mention, he threw a little bit harder than other knuckleballers. He was still able to throw about 85 miles an hour, and also incorporated a changeup, as I recall. So Dickey's repertoire was a little bit different than the traditional knuckleballer, and as I mentioned before, great control, 42 walks, over 174 innings pitched that year, balances out to a 2.2 walk rate over 9 innings for that season, which is incredible. I mean, that's great job. And the strikeouts, as I mentioned, in that first year, not great. 104 strikeouts against 174 innings. So even though he's limiting runs and is difficult to get a home run off him, of course, his FIP is only 3.65 that year against a 2.84 ERA. So he's kind of getting by with a little bit of chicanery, but he's a knuckleballer, so what do you expect? And there's a lot of questions about if he was able to be able to repeat that success. He repeats to some degree the same success. I mean, the season he has afterwards is by most standards worse, but he's still pitching at a very good level. Over 208 innings in 2011. He is clearly the Mets' best pitcher this season. He goes 8-13, 3.28 ERA, with 134 strikeouts against the previously mentioned 208 innings pitched. The walk rate remains about the same, 2.3 that year. He only walked 54 batters in 208 innings pitched. So he's doing basically everything that you're expecting. And in those first 2 years, he is still wildly ahead of expectations. This acquisition is paying off very well for them, and you have to feel that the Mets would feel very satisfied with him being this third or fourth starter. The Mets know that they have prospects coming up soon. They know they have Matt Harvey and Zach Wheeler on the way. There were other prospects to follow, obviously, that we know. But they feel good with him being in that mix, along with guys like John Neese and Dylan G. And this feels like a guy who they can kind of hang their hat on is going to be a guy who's going to be pitching with the team for the foreseeable future as a dependable third, fourth starter. Dickey obliterates expectations in year 3 with the Mets. So 2012, R.A. Dickey puts together one of the greatest seasons in Mets history by a pitcher. He unexpectedly becomes a 20-game winner, the Mets' first 20-game winner in many years at that point. Goes 20-6, posts a 2.73 ERA. The thing to mention about Dickey's year is, while the 20 wins are great and the 2.73 ERA is great, the stats that jump out are he leads the league with 5 complete games, 3 complete game shutouts that year, 233 and 2/3 innings pitched that season, also leading the league, and finally leads the league in strikeouts with 230 strikeouts that year, or 96 more than he had the previous season. Previous year, 134 strikeouts. Season after that, 2012, he strikes out 230. He sees his strikeout rate jump from 5.8 in 2011 to 8.9 in 2012. He makes an all-star team. And most importantly, as all Mets fans know, he wins the Cy Young Award that year, which is a little questionable. There was a lot of people just assuming that at that point that it was really just voter fatigue, if anything, because we know Clayton Kershaw that same year puts together what can generally be viewed as a much better year than what R.A. Dickey does. They're kind of the same, but Kershaw has the better season. Let's say that. He finishes with a lower ERA, and Dickey bests him in complete games, in innings pitched, in strikeouts that year. It's not by much. Kershaw's right behind him, and Kershaw's WAR that year, 6.4, is higher than Dickey's, which is at 5.7. So you can make the guess that Kershaw was probably robbed that year. Dickey blows him away in voting that season. It is an absolute blowout. He finishes with 27 of 32 possible first place votes. So he wins that Cy Young without really any kind of possible challenges from Kershaw, even though arguably Kershaw should have won it that year. And we can point to that mostly being about Dickey just being a great story that season. And he has a fantastic year. That cannot be denied. R. Dickey puts together a career year that is a career year by anybody's standard. But it was an amazing story. He was an out-of-nowhere success story where this guy had come through as a knuckleballer, something that was very rare, and to win a Cy Young Award as a knuckleballer was even stranger. He pitches a couple of gems that year, as everyone will remember, 2 one-hitters back-to-back, and it's still one of the greatest pitching accomplishments of all time. He is an incredible, incredible success story, and everybody is very happy with R. Dickey, and when your value is that high, people are going to take a lot of notice to you about what you're going to do. And the Mets make the decision that his value is never going to be higher than it is now. And they trade him. The trade, as previously mentioned on this list, was to the Toronto Blue Jays. And the Blue Jays had acquired him in exchange for Josh Tolley and R.A. Dickey, and the Mets trade both of those guys off for what was eventually Travis d'Arnaud and Noah Syndergaard, most notably from that trade. So Syndergaard, previously mentioned on this list, it's a pretty important trade, very notable just in terms of what we got for that entire decade. So R.A. Dickey finishes with a terrific 3 years with the New York Mets. And the reason is on to the number 2 acquisition in Mets history is for this reason. He delivers above all expectations. For the 3 years that he's there in total, he finishes with a 2.95 ERA. Again, as a knuckleballer, it's incredible. Wins the Cy Young Award, makes an All-Star team, and is a terrifically beloved player by Mets fans. People still are very fond of R.A. Dickey. I would like to see him maybe come back for Old Timers Day sometime in the near future. I would love to see what R.A. Dickey's doing lately, and he's just a really great person, but also I just a great Met, and I always think very fondly of R.A. Dickey. And in 3 years, to make this list number 2, he does it with the Mets spending very little and getting great results. He deserves to be number 2 on this list, in my opinion, for that reason. So congratulations, R.A. Dickey. You're number 2 on this list. So our final pick for this list, number 1, is going to be Carlos Beltran. And Carlos Beltran, as all Mets fans should know, one of the greatest power speed players of all time. He has a legacy that is somewhat complicated due to his involvement in the Houston Astros sign stealing scandal near the end of his career that kind of helped him win that World Series title. And he was viewed as one of the principal contributors, one of the masterminds of it. There's nothing you can really say in his defense in that case. I don't really believe it was as much of a scandal as everyone thought it was, but so be it. It is sort of his lasting legacy, and something that kept him out of the Hall of Fame this year. When they were voting, he was on the ballot for the first time and was left and did not make the Hall of Fame despite a career that is seemingly built to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And his time with the Mets, a huge part of it. Obviously, prior to signing with the Mets, he had been with the Kansas City Royals and with the Houston Astros. It was with the Astros that his legacy was really established because he goes on this epic postseason run with Houston in 2004 after they acquire him, where he starts hitting home runs at a rate that no one had seen before. I believe 7 home runs in that postseason run, and they didn't even make the World Series that year. So there was a lot of interest on him. He was young when the Mets acquired him. He was, I believe, only 27 when the Mets had signed him as a free agent that year. And that 2004-2005 offseason was a very pivotal one. It's the same offseason that they had signed Pedro Martinez. So when they brought in Beltran, they signed him to this major deal, which was 7 years, $116 million. It was a massive acquisition that the Mets were hoping was going to transform their offense. They certainly had plenty of homegrown talent that was going to be on the rise, especially that year with Jose Reyes and David Wright, and other free agent moves that they had made, like bringing in Cliff Floyd and Mike Cameron. And the hope was that Beltran was going to be this 5-tool threat that was going to blow everyone away, because he had done just that in Kansas City. He won Rookie of the Year in 1999 and was generally seen as a guy who can go 20-20, 30-30, and flirted with a 40-40 season in 2004, finishing the year with 38 home runs and 42 stolen bases. So there were massive expectations. No one really knew what they were going to expect with Beltran in 05. They knew he was going to play also fantastic defense. He had gotten a reputation as a great defender in Kansas City and Houston. So there was certainly a lot of high expectations that were going to coming with Beltran in '05. He does not meet really any of them. He delivers a catastrophic season that can definitely be grouped as one of the worst years of his career in '05. He finishes the year with just 16 home runs. He bats .266, which was around his career mark at the time, a little bit lower than that, but he the lack of power. He stopped stealing bases. People couldn't really figure out what happened there. He only finishes the year with 17. He plays a full season, also 151 games. So his lack of really any type of offensive ability was something that people were kind of scratching their heads at. He plays terrific defense that year. It can't be denied. But he also has one of the most painful to watch injuries in Met history, in all of Major League history, when he dives headfirst into Mike Cameron. This is a brutal injury to watch. I highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, check it out, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's really ugly crash. And his injury is a tough thing to see, and ultimately, it doesn't even play a part in his lack of hitting. He just wasn't hitting that year. And much like Francisco Lindor in that first season with the Mets in 2021, Beltran is pretty much ostracized by the Met community. He is booed frequently, and Beltran, much like Lindor, takes it very personally. So that the following year, 2006, this is the best season of his career, the best season as a Met. He is fully established as an MVP candidate, but he gets off to a slow start, similar to '05. And I'll always remember this: Beltran hitting his first home run in '06. Mets fans cheering him, calling for a curtain call from Beltran, which would have been commonplace that season early on, and Beltran sitting on the bench and seemingly just to sort of stick it to the Met fans. And Julio Franco, who was utility man, bench player at the time for the Mets, Franco going over to him and saying, "You gotta go out there and just poke your head out, say wave your hand, do something," because it got uncomfortably long. It had been about 30 seconds that they were asking him for a curtain call, and he was just not going to do it. And finally, he acquiesces, and he ultimately does it. But it was a very clear indicator of how he felt about Met fans at the time. And if very similar to Lindor, he felt like he'd been kind of betrayed. He felt like they turned on him very quickly, and even though he had not played well in that first season, he had been hoping for a little bit more support in that first season from Met fans. So got off to a rocky relationship with them. Ultimately, his season is, as I said before, fantastic. He finishes with 41 home runs, 116 RBIs. The 41 home runs tied the Met club record at the time that he shared with Todd Hundley. So the 41 home runs, fantastic. He also raises his batting average from up to 275. His OPS was 744 in 2005. In 2006, it is 982. So that's an increase of 200 and almost 40 points, 238 points. So it was an incredible turnaround, one of the most improved players from the previous season. And in '06, a lot of people flashed a power bat, but Beltran's was especially impressive. He was very clutch, came up big in a lot of situations. One of his most notable home runs in '06 was that August shot against the Cardinals, and this back and forth contest with the Cardinals that also, I believe, it was the same game where Carlos Delgado hit his 400th career home run. Beltran, who had been quiet for most of the night, connects with a walk-off home run that lifts everybody. It is probably the signature moment of that season, maybe along with David Wright's walk-off base hit against the Yankees. But Beltran's home run just lights everyone up. Everyone is flying high, and Beltran jumps up, and as he's rounding the bases, coming towards home plate, jumps up. Delivers this giant jump, and Gary Cohen himself says he's got a smile that was rarely seen in '05, but has been off witnessed in 2006. And it's a great line, and it's very appropriate because Beltran was not feeling a lot of love in '05, feeling lots of love in '06. He is a established MVP candidate. He has A great year in the field, won his first Gold Glove at that point, which is interesting because he had been well established as one of the best defensive outfielders in baseball, but had not won a Gold Glove up to that point. So he wins a Gold Glove in '06, and this just kind of establishes him. And for the next portion of his career, he never really reaches the same level, but he continually plays at a high level in '08 and '09. In '07 and '08. He hits 33 home runs, 112 RBIs in '07. '08, 27 home runs, 112 RBIs. And he's delivering good seasons. He wins a couple more Gold Gloves, makes a couple more All-Star teams. In '09, he's having a great year, batting .325, and even in '09, where no one was hitting home runs in Citi Field, Beltran at least has 10 home runs, but unfortunately he gets hurt. So he finishes the year an incomplete season, which was a little unfortunate because he didn't have that many more left, as it turns out, with the Mets. In 2010, he's still recovering from the injury. He returns, but is not really hitting very well, and he has his final season in 2011 with the New York Mets, where he is established as trade bait pretty early on. His contract is ending with the Mets shortly after, so the Mets had put him on the block. There was every intention to trade him. They ultimately traded him to the San Francisco Giants, who a lot of people felt overpaid by trading Zach Wheeler in that trade to acquire Beltran, but the Giants were desperate to field another World Series championship right after their 0-10 one, so they were willing to pay a price that was very high for Beltran, and that ultimately for just a half a season was not a great move for them. Worked out well for the Mets, but Beltran's addition was something that was one that really did transform the Mets franchise. And though they didn't win a World Series during his time with them, he was a tremendous contributor. People will always point, the naysayers will always point to the call of third strike in the '06 National League Championship Series, in that pivotal game where he strikes out and on a curveball that was just a brilliant curveball by Adam Wainwright in relief. And it was sort of the legacy of Beltran's career. He's just like, this is a guy who he couldn't pull the trigger on that strike. It was a curveball over the middle that he couldn't pull the trigger on. He was absolutely fooled. And people were going to look at that as the guy couldn't win something. He was never going to win a series. And it's ultimately the case for much of his career until eventually with the Houston Astros. But he is one of the most special overall players in Met history, and his stats notwithstanding, he was a excellent teammate. I think everybody looked at him as a great example, a guy who was quiet but never made any waves in any way. He always went out of his way to be the guy who was never going to create a lot of controversy. He was a good guy. I always liked him as a Met. He was one of my favorite Met players, and even though that doesn't play into it, I feel like it should be recognized that he was a very good. He was just a solid guy for many years, as well as a all-star player who was easily considered one of the most talented players in Major League Baseball, especially in his prime. But well into past his prime, he was considered a special guy who was a great leader and teammate, and did so many great things for the Major League teams that he played with. And he played with quite a few over the course of his career, but I would look at his time with the Mets as probably his most special. It's probably the team that will be enshrined with him when he eventually makes the Hall of Fame. He should go in as a Met, in my opinion, because he played probably the most pivotal years of his career with New York, and it was something that didn't turn out quite right at first, but ultimately did go well for the majority of his time in New York. So that is something to hang your hat on and look at as whenever you have a major acquisition, someone like a Francisco Lindor or maybe a Justin Verlander. It may not go well in their first season, and you kind of have to just say, all right, so the first year might not be great, second year might be the one that turns it around. And I think Beltran was ultimately a tremendous acquisition, even though they were paying a lot of money for Beltran at the time. It was a acquisition that worked out tremendously well for them. He really did transform that lineup. He was a perfect middle of the order hitter, a great defender, and a great teammate. So congratulations, Carlos Beltran. You are number one on this list.